hosted by IEEE graduate body. And just a few words before we get started about who we are and what we do. And IEEE used to stand for Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, but over the time it has catered to a broader audience, and now it becomes the largest professional association for the advancement of technology. And our group, IEEE GSP, is the first grassroots body in the United States within the IEEE to the best of our knowledge. So our mission is to help increase the network, collaboration, and the depth of knowledge of our grassroots members. So if you're interested in our organization, this is our homepage, and please feel free to check out our webpage and then keep an eye on our upcoming events. But tonight, we are very happy to host an event that is of general interest, which is H-1B visas and green card processing. And we are delighted to have Mr. Kyle Knapp, an immigration attorney with 12 years of experience in this specialized area. He will provide us with an overview of the H-1B visa categories and green card processing to help international students, myself included, to plan our immigration plans. So, Mr. Knapp is an attorney of Power, Wright, Morris, and Arthur LLP at Columbus, Ohio, and he has extensive experience with both employment and family-based immigration, including non-immigrant and immigrant visas, and employment eligibility verification, which is I-9 compliance. And he routinely counsels employers on strategies available for hiring non-citizens. He also assists employers in complying with employment eligibility verification and document retention requirements that apply for all employees. Mr. Knapp's particular areas of concentration include H-1B visas, L-1, intra-company transfers, E-2, E-1, investor traders, TN, Canadian and Mexican professionals, and labor certification, which is green card processing. His experience ranges from processing non-immigrant visas and green cards for engineers and IT professionals to assisting multinational corporations recruit and retain top executives. And Mr. Knapp earned his Bachelor of Arts summa cum laude from The Ohio State University and a JD magna cum laude from Catholic University Law School. So with that, please join me in welcoming attorney Kyle Knapp.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And something interesting today when I got I'll need to get this set up here. Okay. When I saw that the lecture was going to be in this location, I graduated from Ohio State, and my very first lecture at Ohio State was Biology 101. It was in this room. So it's kind of different to be on this side of the lecture hall versus that side of the lecture hall. So today, as you mentioned, we'll talk about the H-1B visa, and then I'll talk a little bit about green card processing. Generally, the two topics, we could talk the entire time about H-1B visas, or we could talk the entire time about green card processing. They're two very specific topics, and green card processing generally gets very involved. But what I wanted to do today, since everyone is here, and I really appreciate everyone coming, is I want to focus on the H-1B visa. I'll talk just a little bit about green card processing, but I wanted to give you a little bit of information about green card processing, just so you have some information that can kind of be a starting point to do some further research and then investigation as you look into your immigration options. I'll leave some time at the end for questions, so if you do have questions as we go through the material here, just feel free to write down some notes, and then we'll save some time at the end for questions. So I always like to start these talks with somebody who wrote a book, Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. And a lot of times when I give these presentations, people say, well, why do we have immigration? What is an H-1B visa? What does all this mean? And Thomas Friedman, in his book, how many people have read this book, The World is Flat? Okay, a couple. How many people have heard of this book? Very good. I would recommend it. It's very good reading. Thomas Friedman, he talks in this book about the United States and how behind the United States is in educating engineering students to become eventually engineers as a profession, to work as an engineer. And he says in his book, he gives the example that when a 4 or 5-year-old kid or a 10-year-old kid thinks, wow, I want to build something, or I want to work with electrical engineering, I want to do something with computers, until that child eventually graduates from college, it's 20 years from that point that the child decides that that's what he or she wants to do. So in the United States, we have a situation now where our schools are not turning out enough engineering students. So in the meantime, what do? We have to bring people and recruit people from other countries, like all of you, and it's great that you're here, because if not, we wouldn't have enough people pursuing engineering professions. So that's a book that I commend that to you. It's very interesting. He brings together a lot of geopolitical and international immigration issues that I think are very interesting. To jump now into the H-1B visa, and tonight I probably will catch myself using the terms visa and status interchangeably. In the immigration world, I'll talk a little bit, there's a few slides later, about the difference between a visa and immigration status. So I'll use the terms tonight from time to time interchangeably, but they really are two very different topics. The general requirement for an H-1B visa is that the offered position has to require at least a U.S. bachelor's degree. And what that means is a 4-year degree. There's some countries around the world, I know India, Canada, I think even Germany recently offers a 3-year bachelor's degree. But when we're talking about the H-1B visa, the basic requirement is that the job itself has to require a U.S. bachelor's degree in a specific field. So when you're out looking for jobs and then you eventually want to pursue an H-1B visa to stay and work in the United States, when you're looking at the advertisements, if the job says this position requires a 2-year associate's degree, that's not going to work. Unfortunately for this group tonight, one of the examples that I always use when I give this talk about the H-1B visa is that the easy H-1B cases are the ones like engineers. Because typically in the engineering profession, you have to have at least a 4-year engineering degree to start that job. And then as I mentioned, the individual then has to have a relevant degree. And then I have a fabulous example here from Winters University. Ohio State is a much better school, so all of you will have a fabulous 4-year degree. At least, I think a lot of you are graduate students, so you're going to be kind of beyond that hurdle. But just as a basic matter, the H-1B visa requires at least a 4-year degree, and then you have to have a relevant degree. The second part of that, the relevant degree, is if you're pursuing a position, for example, electrical engineering, then your degree should be in a closely related field. If you have a civil engineering degree, working with infrastructure and roads and those types of things, then that may not be a good match. If you have an art history degree and you want to work as an electrical engineer, that certainly will not work. So there has to be a correlation between what the job requires and then what your education actually is. There's some basic requirements for the H-1B visa. One of them is that the employer has to be paying the prevailing wage. And the prevailing wage is the average wage for a specific job in a specific geographic region. So if we're going to use the example of an electrical engineer in Columbus, Ohio, we would look to see what that prevailing wage is for this area. And the employer has to commit to pay at least that amount. The employer cannot simply say, well, we're going to pay X amount and then just come up with that number and not have a way to justify it. The employer has to pay a certain amount. There are a couple of ways that the employer can determine the prevailing wage. One is that the employer can take the job description that you're being offered and submit that to the Federal Department of Labor in Washington, D.C., and an analyst at the Department of Labor will look at the job description and then come back with what the minimum required wage is. So for example, if it's an entry-level engineer in Columbus, Ohio, the Department of Labor will come back and say, here's the required wage, and then the employer will have to pay that wage. That's one way. The employer can ask the Department of Labor to assign a prevailing wage. Another way, if the position is a union position, teachers are a good example of that. Public school teachers, there's typically what's called a collective bargaining agreement. where there'll be a specific salary schedule that will outline if you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree and this number of years of experience, then the wage is this amount. That's another way to determine the prevailing wage. And then that collective bargaining agreement would set the prevailing wage. The other way is to look at a private survey. There are different consulting companies that provide statistical data for different occupations. One for engineering, one that I'm most familiar with, is called Towers Perrin. I think it just merged with another company, but that's kind of a human resources company. They provide statistical data for different occupations, and the employer could look to that to establish the prevailing wage. But the bottom line on the basic requirement here is that the employer cannot just come up with a wage and not support it. There has to be some basis for the salary that you're being paid. The next basic requirement, when we talk about maintaining status, if you have, a lot of people here tonight maybe have an F-1 visa or a J-1 visa, and those are student visas or exchange visitor visas. And if you have an F-1 visa, when you're in the United States, to maintain your status, and here I'm talking about visas and status, so once you're here in the United States, to maintain your status, if you have an F-1 visa to study electrical engineering at Ohio State, then you need to be taking a full course of study at Ohio State. You can't go to the beach. Once you then change from F-1 student visa to H-1B, what you need to be doing is working. So if you're a scientist, you're working in a lab. One exception, if you're sick, or you have an illness, or you have a close relative, a family member you need to care for, and you need to take time off work, then that will be okay. You also could take a vacation, and you could go to the beach, but you can't get H-1B status and then just sit on the beach. You have to be working. So you can take a little bit of a vacation, but you can't be doing more than that. So that's on your side as the employee. So once you have H-1B status, to maintain your status, what you need to do is you need to be working and then also getting paid, and that gets to the employer side of the equation. So the employer's obligation is once you have H-1B status, then the employer has to pay your salary. And then secondly, there's no grace period. Once your employment ends, then your status ends as well. So unfortunately, if you're in H-1B status, and once you've changed over to H-1B status, for example, if you have F-1 status, then if your job ends at 5 o'clock on Friday, then you are no longer in valid status as of Friday at 5 o'clock. With F-1 student status, typically you have 60 days. So at the end of your studies or after your optional practical training, your employment period ends, then you have 60 days. Once you're in H-1B status, if your employment ends and you don't have another job lined up, then you do not have a valid H-1B status once your employment ends. Typically, what the government recognizes, however, is about a 30-day grace period. And it's not in the regulation. I mean, it's typically just, if your job ends with company A this week, and then within 30 days, if you find a job with company B, and company B files a petition to sponsor you for H-1B, we'll talk more about sponsorship a little bit later, but if within that 30 days, if you have a second job lined up and a petition filed, a new H-1B petition, then your status will be maintained. But again, in the regulation, in the law, there is no grace period. It's very specific. And that's something from your side, what you want to be thinking about is if your job ends, then you want to be finding another